Celtic palliative care nurse, which means I'm fascinated by the dead and the dying, which makes me ask, what am I doing here with you if you're not dead and dying? So let's talk about the dying. One of the things you know well is the dying and the dead travel backwards and forwards from the other world to this world. In fact, some come back so often you've got to bury them and send them back home to the other world, especially the young. And I want to talk about one in particular, Rabbie Burns, the national poet of Scotland. Now, he was young when he died, only 37 years old, loved life, loved the lassies. It wouldn't make sense for him to be buried for eternity just under the ground twiddling his thumbs, now would it? He'd be one that would travel from the other world back to this world and have to be buried again. So my question to you is, how often was Burns buried? Was he buried once and once only, or twice, or thrice, or four? We have the afternoon to while away. So pick a number and let the story begin. 1796, Burns died, a pauper. His wife said, I'm so sorry, I have no money to bury him. The council said, oh well, very well, we'll do it. But you realise it'll be a pauper's funeral. Oh, he'll be buried in the cemetery, but not in a plot. He'll be buried under the pathway and forever walked upon. We'll never know peace. Dreadful, said his mates, and had a quick whip around and raised the money to buy a cheapy plot on the north side of the cemetery where the sun never shone. So the funeral went ahead, and what a funeral it was. All the lords and lairds and lassies came from throughout Scotland, the hoi polloi came down from England, everyone in the air in the district attended. Marvellous. So there you have it, 1796, buried in the north side of the cemetery. So for ye who said, buried once and once only, this is your moment. Relish it. For your rhyme. After the funeral, the English government met and said, look at that, those Scots. En masse, not a good idea. And that man Burns wrote poetry asking for equality of the classes. That's treason. Tell them to stop at once, or they'll be more revolting than they usually are. So England decreed, Scots, no more about Burns. There'll be no funerals, headstone. So the Scots said, we hear you, and promptly set about raising money. 19 years later, they had enough money to buy a plot on the sunny south side of the cemetery, build a huge mausoleum with a new coffin to match. Now, wouldn't you think, after the magnificence of the first funeral, the second funeral would be equally grand when they transferred from the old to the new grave? But an odd thing happened. His wife and family were paid to take a vacation in the countryside for 2 weeks. Even odder, the council were not informed. And oddest of all, it happened at midnight. At midnight, the exhumation party marched down the main street of Ayr, came to the cemetery, shimmied up and over the wall, and went to the old grave, dug up the coffin, and they were just in the process of transferring Burns from the old to the new coffin when, oops, something went wrong and his head fell off. Well, they shoved all the bits in the new coffin, but they were spooked. Fortunately, someone had the good sense to bring a bottle, so they all had a wee dram. But as you know, on occasions like this, one will not do it. So the bottle circulated, and they sat down and began swapping stories of Burns, totally forgetting that in Scotland there are always wee wifeys that sit behind the curtains watching, morning, noon and night. They had seen the exhumation party travel down the main street of Ayr, but did not return. In time they signalled to each other, and by bush telegraph agreed, time to knock up the men folk. And they did, they roused the men, they aroused their neighbours, and by dawn the men gathered in the main street of Ayr and began marching down that road to the cemetery. They came to the gates and rattled the gates, while that aroused the exhumation party, who said, "Oh, sorry, it's okay." Quickly, they ran the new coffin to the mausoleum, shut it in, locked the door, and came to the cemetery gates and unbarred the gate. And the people flowed in like torrents of water, say the newspapers, which you can read to this day if you go to Glasgow, to the Macmillan Library. The papers are there. So there you have it, 1796, buried in the north side of the cemetery. 19 years later, 1815, buried in the sunny south side in the new mausoleum. So for ye who said buried twice and twice only, this is your moment. Relish it. You're wrong. The story continues. 19 years later, the rage was phrenology. That's when they measure the circumference of the head and try and equate it with intelligence. And people were saying, our Burns had a big head, you know. Someone should measure it. It'd be useful if it was done soon. And then finally the exhumation party said, all right, we'll go and do it. So again, at midnight, they marched down the main street of Ayr, came to the cemetery, shimmied up and over the wall, went to the mausoleum, opened it up and took out the head of Burns. Because it was raining, they put it in a hat, but too big, it wouldn't fit in the hat. So they put it in the hands of the local rector, the minister, Rector Macmillan, and then up and over the wall, went to the house of the local carpenter. There they measured the head, and normally a head circumference is 21, maybe 22 inches. This was an amazing 25 inches. You see, they said, we were right to do it. And then someone said, you know why you've got the head of Burns out here? Why don't you take a casting? So a casting was taken, and a copy of that casting was given to a sculptor who used it for his statue of Burns, which stands to this day in Albany, New York. And that was done, the party processed back to the cemetery wall, shimmied up and over, took the head back to the mausoleum, packed it away, closed up. So there you have it, 1796, buried in the north side of the cemetery. 19 years later, 1815, buried in the sunny side in the south in the new mausoleum. 19 years later, 1834, buried after measuring and casting. So for you who said buried thrice and thrice only, this is your moment. Relish it. You run. 4 years later, the exhumation party were again at the graveside, but this time it was the afternoon. It was the occasion of the burial of one of the sons of Burns. After the funeral, the party had departed. The exhumation party went to the mausoleum, took out the head of Burns, and put it in a double casket they had brought. The inside was a tin casket that sat inside a wooden casket. Once the head was in the tin casket, they poured in pitch to stabilise the head. When it was set, they closed both lids and returned the casket to the mausoleum. Then with Scottish exactitude, put up a plaque. Here lies the head of Rabbie Burns. So there you have it. 1796, buried on the north side of the cemetery. 19 years later, 1815, buried in the sunny side in the new mausoleum. 19 years later, 1834, buried after measuring and casting. 4 years later, 1838, buried after stabilizing in pitch. So for ye who said 4 and 4 only, this is your moment, relish it. I have to hand it to you, because I have no more evidence to contradict it. So you have